Okay, so I think the sound is okay in class, and apparently also okay in Zoom. Good. I have the assignment 3. I tried to have it on time today, but I updated this lecture, which was a bit in need of it, and it took a long time. So actually, it's a bit frustrating because it took a long time, but it doesn't look much nicer with the updates. But anyhow, that's the thing. So the assignments, assignment 3 of MEP, all those who are on time, I will try to post online, right? I will scan and post online this weekend so you can work on it. And assignment 4, I will give it next Friday in class. We'll comment later, right? So I have 3 sets of assignment 2 still here. So if you want to work on it, this is Kim Jie. Is this yours? Okay. And Hong Jimin, not here. So many people submit Aina. So many people submit on paper, but they never come to class. And I have assignments from April still in my hand. So, well, we can do something with it. So we are recording, we are in class. So let's start with the lecture. So today we deal with the energy. And I said, I try to update things. So this lecture was first prepared in 2010, and it needed some updating, right? Actually, it is the part which is most studied, and surely had a better teaching in other courses about it. But still, to be consistent, I give a summary of possibilities. And again, I try to be practical. So in many cases, like a long checklists, I will not read all of them, but you have them at hand if you want to use them in your projects. So this is where we stand. We are in the fourth part. Design issues we will see in the following 2 weeks. Before we go into the lecture, the Seoul Energy Drink Center visit, we agreed to have, so we can thank Uri Jiwon Jokyonim for working with the Seoul Energy Drink Center. So they agreed to give a special tour to the building to us on Thursday morning. We set the time 11:15. So I know the class of architectural profession is online, but many people will come from the school. So 1 hour is the time you need to reach there from school, right? And the visit is about 1 hour, 1 hour, 10 minutes. So you usually have time to go back to studio if you have a studio that afternoon. So it's the best we could achieve. It is teaching day, right? The survey I extended to midnight because probably some people will busy and have no time, but so far 10 people already booked for it. So with 10 people, the visit is okay, we can have it, right? And well, just in Blackboard, we have the details. Yeah, the question is, that's any doesn't visit, and it's the best we could get before the end of the semester. The assignment 4 online volunteer, so far about almost 20 people took it, and actually it was not bad. So many people are getting between 60 and 100% of their points, which is not bad. So all people who did it will have some improvement in the grades. Still, you can do it till tonight. So you still have the opportunity to complete it if you want to improve your grades somewhat. So let's go into the subject, because this is, as usual, a long lecture and very packed with information. We already saw social and cultural issues, and we went also to the site issues, which there is a lot of things we commented we can do, mostly in urban planning and this urban design, but also in the smaller scale of one building. Then we had the material issues, in which the most important was the life cycle, right? It's like the thing we work more. And related to it, the construction waste, which we see was not a smaller problem. So let's go to energy issues. And I simplified the animations, but I forgot to use this one. So energy issues, again, is very well studied, it's very wide, and it deserves a full lecture. In materials, we shrank this into 4 or 5 slides, right? Which will be kind of a conclusion of today's class. Today we'll try to go a bit more issue one by one, again, to be practical in a way that you could find ways to have a checklist for your projects. So there's like 5 basic issues, right? We know the non-renewable sources are a problem. We know that pollution is a problem also. That we have an environment, as we said, very much dependent on energy and technology, that energy cost is rising and the design process is fragmented. This has to do with the integration we saw last week. This is a graph I show always because it is very interesting and also a very good example on how to map a lot of data and difficult concepts in one single graph, right? This is not invented there, but actually well done. I think the first graph of this kind was done in the 19th century, right? But still, this is a lot. And this is like a worldwide energy production map. And this is, I think, 2011. It's already, again, 9 years old, or wait, no, 11 years old, right? But it's still interesting because the change is not so big as we would expect. And what we see is that renewable energy is a very small part, right, of the map. Most of it is the usual oil, coal, and nuclear. But what I want to show here is that dark green lines. This is lost energy, right? And the numbers are very small, but it's over 55%. So we have a huge problem of energy. We depend on it. And with our very high technology, we waste more than half of what we produce. If we were able to work on that area, instantly we have twice as much energy as we really have. And there's a problem with many things, right? How energy is produced, how it is transported, how it is used. So there's small losses, which in the end result in wasting more than half of what we produce. And I think it's quite embarrassing with the level of development we have nowadays. This is interesting calculation. You have the Wolfram Mathematica. You can go online. I have quite interesting things you can do. And I calculated the energy spent by person, and I compared United States, Japan, Spain, and Korea, right? In the period 1980 to 2010. Interestingly, something we know that America is the ideal. Actually, their consumption is quite flat, but United States is kind of energy predator. Right? They consume so much energy. And that includes very advanced states as California and so on. Japan is a small country and quite efficient. And actually, they're quite flat for the last few years, but still they are relatively high in energy consumption, which is quite interesting. And Korea and Spain, I chose because, okay, it's our both countries, right, of most of us. And they are very similar in terms of population and economy. Not in size of country, Spain is a bit larger, quite larger, but population and economic power is not so far away. And curiously, since the 80s, Korea just overpassed Spain in terms of consumption, right? So the tendency is to consume more and more, even though the tendency is to flatten a little bit. So that graph before just showed that our tendency, no matter how much we try, is to spend more and more energy. That means we need more, but that's limited, right? We know about it. So this is a graph from the last big oil crisis was 2008. And the production and the cost, right, So the possibilities of production were really going down and the cost went up. This is when the, well, curiously, some wars, curiously in the oil production areas started, right? Both in South America, Central America, and the Mid East. The United States started the fracking method to have more aggressive approach to obtain oil, right? So many politics go on. But this is something I would update. First oil crisis was 1973. It was the moment in which we said we have to save energy. It was the first time in history we thought about it. Until 2020, the consumption of energy is going up, no matter what. And surprisingly, no matter how many crises we have, oil consumption has increased. How is it? How come, right? This is until 2 years ago. That's the COVID point, right? The COVID crisis made a stop in the economy, but if we remove that from the equation, no matter how conscious we are consuming more and more oil. And coal kind of flattened, but still we spend more coal than before, right? And some papers said that renewable energy is not possible because we have way too much need of energy. So I have a question for you, just to start in from the beginning. It's about how well you know Korea, maybe better than me. You know the percentage of energy produced in Korea from coal and the percentage from renewable energies around now, right? How much percentage you think Korea uses from coal and how much percentage from renewable energy? About today, yeah. I don't have statistics. I will give you the statistics I found from 2020, just before the crisis of COVID. I know the intentions of the government. Okay, it is hard, but interesting because we don't have like a clear information on what's going on. Well, you made your bet. Actually, it's not too bad. I found 2 years ago from official site, you have the reference below, coal is 36%, which is a lot. And then renewable was 8%. And the target is to increase 1% year by year, but I don't know how much it came because COVID crisis disrupted many of the plans, right? But that means that we shouldn't blame on China all the fine dust we have, right? Let's continue. And that's the point. Pollution is also a consequence of that huge need of energy, not only on the energy production, but also on the extraction of prime materials and the processing for having that energy. So how much of that pollution is related to building? How much responsible are we architects and the industry about it? So there's some statistics about sulfur dioxide, which is very corrosive gas. Buildings are almost half of the whole pollution in the world, right? If we speak of nitrogen oxide, this is still near 1/5, which is not respectable. And CO2, which is the one we always comment, but it's not the only thing we have. Sorry. Is again more than 1/3, right? Which is a lot. But the point is not only carbon what we produce. Buildings are responsible, and that sulfur is very corrosive and quite harmful. And this is all the statistics, but for things I checked later, the percentage didn't change much. Then what we commented often when we spoke about envelope, especially an interior environment, our civilization, the way we live, is almost 100% energy dependent, right? And that's a problem. This is a chart from the United States, right? But the percentage didn't change. So in the United States, about almost 40% of the energy is going to buildings. That means buildings in use, right, and in construction produce all that pollution. And you see here that still non-renewable energies are a big chunk of the American production of energy, right? Coal percentage is small, but still petroleum and gas is a huge chunk of that production. In general, and then that statistics for the United States, by countries it changes a lot because the climate and the habits have to do a lot. But Korea follows very much the American way of life in many aspects, so to be very close to it. So curiously, in the States, the largest expenditure of energy is lighting, which is surprising. Unless you are like a night people and only live at night, in most areas of America, you have plenty of daylight for half the day. But that means that since the 1960s, right, there was actually a scientific publications which were very successful, in which people said, artificial light, now we can mimic daylight. And we have air conditioning to have perfect ventilation and perfect air. So we don't need windows. We don't need to open them. We only need windows if we need light, right? And that still stands still today, which is surprising. Then the rest is, of course, if you put cooling and heating together, it's a big chunk, climate control, and finally the appliances, right? So what I want to stress is how important is to consider daylight in the design, because that saves like a one cell of energy, except nighttime, of course, but that's interesting thing. The next point is the energy price. And now with the COVID crisis and wars going on in Europe and Middle East, things are getting tight, right? So that was the price of oil. This is the 2008 energy crisis, right? It was like the highest in history. But suddenly it went down. This, well, we cannot analyze why, but the question is that the price changes a lot. This is more recent graph. This is 2008. You see how it went down. As soon as it goes down, the panic relieves and people relax again. But see how it has times of peaking and not, right? This is a COVID, when the activity stopped, prices fell down, but then we have many things going on and the prices go up. So we cannot rely, so if our economy is based on energy and our life is based on energy consumption, it's very hard to plan in this way, right? And we know that at some point, this will not be reversible. The energy will be so precious, so reduced that we'll pay whatever to have it. And finally, it's fragmented design process. We don't need to insist because it has to do very much with what we called about integration, right? So the question is, as we commented, mechanical ventilation, fluorescent light, make people believe we can create artificial environments. And designers, engineers, included architects, never thought of users as human beings, just as numbers, right? In statistics. And we end in a kind of artificial environment, kind of a Truman Show of architecture, right? Which we create artificial ecosystem and we become like a just software of the hardware, which is the buildings we create. So in that context, which strategies we can use in our design, in our projects to make things better? So there's many things going on. The ones we're more familiar because we have to comply with them is the energy standards. Every country and set of countries are revising them almost year by year, right? Which is a pain because you have to study a lot of regulations almost non-stop. We have better tools for simulation, so we can be more precise in our calculations. we, of course, improve that kind of integration in the design, collaborate more in one teams. Then renewable energy resources, right? We cannot rely only on fossil fuels, but it is easy to say, hard to do, even if you are committed and even if you have the money for it, right? It's not easy. And then last, but should be the first, right? As we see, you know, the need is the keyword we're repeating so much, right? Because we are aware what we need, and probably we can live comfortable life and reasonable life with much way less energy consumption, right? And this is some lists which we will see a little bit more in detail later. So energy standards are changing, and it was hard to update, but I give you some numbers to see how difficult it is to implement things, right? So in 2008, the European consumption was like between 200 and 300 kilowatts hour. This is total energy used per square meter per year. It's very wide margin, right? But it gives you very much an idea of how much the building will consume in general with 14 years ago standards. America was always in the upper side, right? I'm not sure about Korea, probably closer to Europe, as we saw before in the early calculations, right? And the targets in 2004, right, for Korea was to reduce about half that average, right? Curiously, more stringent in commercial buildings. Usually it's the opposite. The regulations are much more strict with residential. I don't know why, but the idea was 4 years ago to reduce it to half. I don't have the results of statistics of Korea right now. If you find them, you can tell me and share. But I looked for Europe yesterday because for me it's much easier to navigate European information. So in 2008, it was between 200 and 300. It's 14 years creating more restrictive legislation and regulations and giving subsidies and so on. And in 2013, which is the nearest, the most modern I could find yesterday, we still have between 300, 100 and 200. But this is like a very warm countries, right? So actually Spain is in the 100. So we are doing well because in those countries, we don't have the habit of using so much air conditioned. We still like to open the windows in summer, right? And winter is not so hard. If you go to the largest consumption, it's like really cold countries, right? Like in North Europe, in continental Europe. But the point is that the reduction was not as radical as expected, by far not half. So I'm curious to see what happened in Korea. But the point is that the political intention and the effort not always as a result. So most standards work hard on envelope and the mechanical systems and then lighting. As we saw this, like the three parts in which we use more energy. And you see that this is mostly in the use of the building. Again, the embodied energy of the construction phase is ignored, but I think it should be included in the regulations. I didn't see any country who sets limits on how much energy, how much pollution you produce when constructing, right? When building. But that apart, envelope, we spoke already, mechanical systems, we went fast into it, and lighting, well, we could do so much here, right? And there are many international proposals. Curiously, there was factor 4, factor 10, those things already disappeared. And the challenge 2030, which is something which was done like 20 years ago, right? No, 10 years ago, sorry, is already going on. But as we will see, curiously, it's becoming 2050, right? So the ideals are really hard to implement. So factor 4 was important just by improving, by reducing in half the needs, we become 4 times as wealthy in ecological terms. The factor 10 Institute was interesting because they did a lot of research, but I didn't see any update since probably 5 or 6 years. So I think this is already dead. Historical, but 2030 was very influential, right? And many countries stuck to it. And this is why 2030 is a date in many agendas from the European Union, from the States, and even from Korea, right? That comes from this kind of movement. The point is very easy, right? By 2020, which is 2 years ago, the residential buildings should be zero net energy, right? And non-residential like 10 years later. Again, I don't know why that pressure on the poor residential individuals, right? When the big corporations have more power to implement those things, but that's something else. The problem is that zero net energy is not clear agreement on what it means, and that changes a lot of the results. The points were like, as we said, by around now, we should be like having about, if we make interpolation, probably 85%, right? With the of energy with renewable sources, or the saving of 85%, right, compared to 2010. And well, this is by designing better, by implementing passive systems, right? And that would include having a large part what we need of additional energy on renewable sources. So the point is saving probably 80% of energy only on passive strategies. And if we reduce so much as to have only 20% of needs, that could be supplied by locally produced renewable energies, right? Which is interesting. So that's the ideal. And actually had a lot of influence. So if you go to the map of a zero energy building, many buildings were speaking of 2020, 2030, right? Spain is going around there. United States, well, it's too small for me to see, but the 2030 appears many times. And Korea also stuck to it, actually, very clearly. They give like a 5 years more for housing, 2025 and 2030 for commercial. Again, I don't know how it is adjusted, but 2025 is 3 years from now. I'm not sure how close we are to have zero energy building in the housing here in Korea. And this was commented. This was yesterday looking at the European, now we have Green Deal, right? And the target is extended to 2015, not 2030 anymore, curiously. Of course, this is wider, it's kind of simplification. But what I comment is that political agenda does not always work as expected, right? If we go back to Korea, this is interesting because in the full construction area, the big majority of buildings are residential. And of that, the big majority is apartments, which is very frustrating because apartments are out of the hands of architects, are in the hands of corporations. So the largest the largest impact of a construction industry in terms of construction is not in our hands, right? Unless we work for those big corporations, which I don't know if it will ever change. But I wish architects were at least in charge of residences, right? Again, for corporations, users are just numbers, right? Just based on profit, investment, and little else. This was the plan a few years ago. I don't know how much it changed, but the 2025 for Korea was the target for zero energy house for housing, right? I don't know how much we went along there, but it's really tough to be zero energy, even with today's means, is really a hard commitment. Second point, simulation tools. Okay, so calculating better, we can know better the needs. I can fine tune both the design and the systems, right? And actually, the problem with the traditional way of doing, even today, most companies will go to the rules of the thumb. And that's very much what happens in Korea. You will have a perfect simulation, a very fine-tuned calculation. You go to the construction company, we do like this, right? And they will put, as usual, because they are sure it works, and they don't need to have that time, that cost of engineering and that cost of changing ways of doing. And that brings over-dimensioned, inefficient systems, and of course, loss of space, right? So everything becomes more expensive. Just to make things easier, for the engineers of those companies who make installation, which is not very good habit. So with simulation, you have possibilities to have more alternatives, to make more choices, right? And to fine tune much better what you do. So the problem with this is to change the habits, especially the habits, right? And if you go to the real world and you work for design or construction company, you will see that it's very difficult to change ways of doing, right? Everything will be detailed based on silicon, no matter how thick it is. All details are just silicon filling, and everything is you have this duct, and it works for all the construction. So it's hard to make, right? So integration is the other keyword, right? We need to have really not only architects, but engineers and construction companies and users committed to make that effort and that extra cost. Of course, the usage is important. So as we commented, nothing works if the user does not make a good use of the things. Unfortunately, we have plenty of tools. No matter how much we can complain about America's dominance in many areas, this is quite generous. They produce an excellent tool for simulation. Is open worldwide. And actually, many local software, like Spanish software, is elaborated, it's a shell over this American system, right? So you can use it. DOE2 is like a gold standard in the world. Then you have eQuest, which is kind of a bit more user-friendly. And this here we can say friendly, user-friendly software. It has kind of it's easier to use. Still, I think free. Energy 10 is another software which is open and over that same core. And just you have Radiance, which is kind of a lighting simulation tool. It's kind of works for both render and light simulations. And we commented in the natural lighting class. So I have a second question here. I'm curious about this because I comment in every class, but which of those softwares are you familiar with, or you know before, or you use? And if you use them, do you think they help in the design process, or it's just an after design tool to check how things work? There's two questions. First, if you are familiar with any of those or something different, and what is your experience with it if you use it? If you didn't, nothing to say, right? But if you use in some of their courses or when doing internship, it's used mostly as a design tool to see alternatives and to make choices, or it's just like a checking how one given design works after design. Two easy questions, I think. Well, easy to ask. I'm not so sure they're easy to reply. So you have a couple of minutes to think about this. Okay, we have a lot of replies. That's interesting. Good. Then let us continue. So collaboration on teams, I will just go fast because this is the same as integration. I will insist more in the design issues. But important thing as always, the needs and the goals must be clear and agreed, otherwise the design doesn't work, right? Commissioning is interesting because that means it's not only architect, engineers, and construction companies, it's a different party who just checks things are correctly done. There's not any kind of mistake or disadjustment. And then, as we say, coordination between teams. And this is just examples, right? Like, okay, windows are not only decoration, not only for views, and that impacts. So you can discuss with engineers how much windows can be improved, right? And that happens with other things. We already commented how we put different systems related to each other and so on, right? Interesting is the thermal massing. which also commented when we were speaking of envelope. And for structure, the overload of the systems, because we put a huge machines, right? And sometimes it is causing the disaster, and it happens in Sampung department store, right? So, and then renewable energies is a hot debate, but it's interesting because it's not always easy. Photovoltaics is like the gold standard, it's the first thing we think about. And I will not read all of it. I think we all know the advantages and the problems. The problem is, even though they went very much down in price and much more efficient, they're still expensive. And it's a big investment that not always makes sense. But to be practical, I gave you like a basic rules of the thumb on how much area you need to preview on solar panels to produce some amount of energy. So we know we have already the data of the target being like 100 kilowatts hour, right, per square meter per year. And you have how much you can produce per the installed area, right? So you can have a basic estimation on how much area you need. And you will be surprised, probably. You need as much area as the building itself, the floor area of the building, to have reasonable production of energy, which is a lot. This is where reducing needs is important. Again, this has been updated recently, but the technology changes. So there's a big range between 50 and 100 is a big difference. And of course, that depends very much on the climate. You will always need specialized study, but to have a rough idea on how much you will need, or how much you will be able to cover, those might help, right? And of course, integrated photovoltaic is one of the ways to go, right? It's one of the difficulties we have also, and there's plenty of examples. Of course, the efficiency changes a lot depending on the system we use. But all that says, to be really serious about photovoltaic, we need a huge amount of area with the panels, right? Just the few panels you see in some buildings are just to look good, not really to be really effective in energy use. Wind energy is a bit more difficult in building, but still is interesting. The advantages, curiously, are a bit cheaper comparatively to the photovoltaics in terms of energy, but the elements are quite expensive and need a lot of maintenance. That's the problem. And then the technology we have now still expensive, and they are noisy, and they're not totally safe, right? So there's the problems. And sometimes it is just for looking good, as it happens with photovoltaic panels, right? You have a Professor Won. She has an example. She worked for 1 year to make a real high technology turbine in one building. And with all feasibility studies and simulations, they would produce like a 0.001% of the energy of the building. It's totally useless, right? And of course, they need maintenance because otherwise they may have problems, right? And that's one of the worst. This doesn't happen with photovoltaic. This is why still photovoltaic is preferred over windmills in building. There's several examples, right, of small turbines for building, but still you have to find the market. You have small numbers for, I don't know which, I think it's this one, the right, but I think I gave some numbers. So very few examples of buildings have it, and I didn't see what's the real use. As we said, the corners is a good point in high rise because it's where wind concentrates, you have more pressure. But still, it's not a high building, it's quite enclosed city, it's not open air. Probably the corners of Burj Khalifa will collect much more energy, right? But if you have that massive tower with a lot of windmills, I don't know how it would affect that energy capture in the stability of the structure. This is going on, and it's quite interesting because even today there are new patents to avoid the wings moving around, but just based on the vibration from the wind, right? So that produces not so much noise, and it's much easier to maintain. It's not so dangerous, and still can produce a significant amount of energy. I don't know. I'm not so invasive to the landscape. So again, I got some data from the United States in small turbines. So you have the basic numbers if you really want to or plan to use those in some project. So you know how much is the efficiency and even the cost, right? Which is quite interesting. Right? Again, this is the US-based numbers, can change a lot and prices move a lot, but you have a rough idea. It's much better to have a rough idea what you want to do than putting things without no idea on how effective they could be. Biomass is another hot and very trendy element to use, which I really don't understand. The moment you put bio, it seems it is green, it is possible, but biomass is just burning timber, right? What's ecological about it? I'm not sure. Again, there is a lot of advantages. Of course, this is what they say. The good thing of biomass is that we can produce trees, we can grow them. It's not limited, right? And it's relatively cheap. It's cheaper to grow trees than to drill for petrol. But yet it is just combustion. So the question of pollution is not improved. And it's a very rough way of doing things. And if you have the biofuel produced by crops like corn, things like that, we may create a problem with food. Actually, as we commented, there is kind of alarm about coming food crisis. And it's not a good idea to use the food just to produce fuel and burn, right? As our mom said, you never play with food. Food is a serious thing, right? And I think it's important because basically we need to eat first. And of course, to make this kind of fuel efficient crops, you will need to have a lot of genetic engineering, which again is a bit scary in some aspects. Well, there's a lot of information published about how ecological it is and how can close the cycle so you can produce biomass, return the remainings to the fertilizers and produce more fuel. But again, it has those problems I spoke. So I personally, and this is my opinion, I'm not so comfortable with it. I don't think it's so great for ecological. It's an alternative in some way, right? But curiously, in the recent years and the forecast for the United States to use more and more biomass. And I think that's general, right? It used to be very cheap, but as the demand goes on, it's not so cheap anymore. And with the drawbacks, the problems we commented. Interestingly, there are projects for using not biomass, but human waste. You know, as we commented the other day, human waste is humongous, especially in big cities. Imagine those cities with 100 million inhabitants. I didn't know, but I heard yesterday Jakarta already passed the 100 million in Indonesia. So they need to build a new city because they cannot hold anymore. The island is sinking. But imagine the waste produced by 100 million people in the same city. So there are projects about it. And actually, some experiments in the UK were quite efficient. They could produce a lot of energy, right? Just by treating the human waste, which is interesting. And at a smaller scale, they do that with the dogs in the parks. This is a smaller experiment, but it's kind of encouraging people to collect the dog waste, which, you know, the moment the pets become more popular, you have the problem of having waste all around. Well, it's not necessary, but interestingly, that's a possibility we have. I don't know how much percentage we produce, but that exists. And this is what we commented before. That hype for biofuel and biomass really is creating problems with food supply in many countries, right? So many countries thought that they would have more profit selling the crops for fuel because they pay more, and the population ended having not available food supplies, right? You can speak of Brazil and large production countries in which that kind of become an unbalanced problem. Fuel cells, and here we speak of hydrogen fuel cells. This was kind of exotic technology, but now it is commercially available, which is great. You have still cars. I think Hyundai is selling one car on hydrogen fuel. Toyota is working at it. Still, you have to be very brave to buy and use one of those cars, but the technology exists. So it has a lot of advantages because it is very safe technology. You don't need to have a high temperature. It is relatively compact, and this is relatively. We'll see why. And it's almost instant. When you need energy, you can produce almost instantly. You can stop. So it's very, very reliable and very flexible technique. But still, today it is expensive. It's expensive, and you cannot have everywhere. And I don't know how the technology works, but the cells have a short life, so you have to replace them, and it's an extra cost, right? Like all batteries, they just need to be replaced. And then the problem is to get the hydrogen, right? Because the fuels work with hydrogen, pure hydrogen and oxygen, and the combination is what produces energy. And you only produce water. So look, you maybe have seen, we had one experimental hydrogen fuel in something one in the campus next to the school. It was interesting. I didn't see it anymore. But that's the aspect. They paint in green, of course. To be ecological, you need to have a lot of green and trees painted there. So the principle is very simple, right? So if you combine hydrogen plus oxygen, wow, we have water, a small process. And the energy produced in that combination is what we use. And again, it is almost instant. You can open, close, and it goes very well. So you need just to create the hydrogen. And this is the weak point, right? That reformer, the production of hydrogen. It goes into one chamber. You have a membrane in which the ions can conduct, and the oxygen is from the air. It's no problem. And because they have different charges, they will instantly connect and create water and the energy which we use for the net. There is commercially available hydrogen fuel cells since quite a few years. So this kind of domestic cell in the UK, we have in a race, this is Alaska, of course. In Alaska, maybe you have difficult to have a network and you can produce locally things. I went online, I can find quite a few commercial elements available. This is, you can buy tomorrow, can be shipped. And this is compact, just 4 by 1 meters and 2 meters high. But this is a 5 kilowatt unit. If you have a gas boiler in your house or apartment for the heating, which are probably this size, right? Those boilers produce at least twice the energy of this fuel. Right? So that means the technology is there and it's great, clean, and so on, but it's expensive and it's huge, nothing compact, right? Because this is producing the same energy as that small boiler you have in your kitchen, right? With gas, but still interesting. Geothermal and heat pumps. Okay, heat pumps you can use with air, water. So whenever you have a mass of water, if you're near to a river, to the sea, right, or lake, you can use that water because water temperature is much more stable than air temperature. Air heat pumps work very well, however. So even with extreme climate of Korea, we have now heat pumps which can be very, very efficient. Even in the minus 15 degrees days, they can produce heat with a reasonable usage of energy. But the hype is in the geothermal. It's kind of very much pushed. And there are countries where have a lot of volcanic activity, right? I didn't see so much in Japan, but currently Iceland is like the mecca of geothermal, right? You move the sand and you have a vapor going out. Philippines, they have so many volcanoes, and El Salvador. So all volcanic areas have like a big percentage of their energy based on that, and it's very helpful. If you're not in that area, the ideal is go to very deep, up to 6 kilometers, right? And you have heat enough to collect it and use it. So it's like a very, let's say, relatively unlimited, and I will go into that later, but this is quite expensive infrastructure. So you have to be very sure it will work. I never saw this kind of a construction. I have seen in the hundreds of meters, right? 100 to 100 meters. That depends very much. This is the most common I have seen. And that happens anywhere, but depends very much on the soil quality. So you need an expert, but not every soil will be so easy to provide and to collect energy. They need some kind of conductivity, some kind of compactness, and not all rivers are the same, right? And of course, one thing when you do in this kind of more usual thing, when you don't go to the kilometers to go to the hot part of the world, is that you have a building with your coils going down, right? Like several hundred meters, 100, 200, 300, not kilometers. In winter, you are collecting the heat, right? And that's, so you have kind of a fluid going through the pipes that will exchange energy, and that will provide you the energy in winter. What you do is you keep cooling that underground. The more heat you need, the more you cool. So that means that in summer, right, you have to return that heat down to cool. So you keep, it's kind of huge storage element. If you have very mild winter, probably in summer, efficiency will lower a little bit. So this is the only drawback. It is very efficient in climates where you have a day and night, or especially season by season, seasonal changes, right? The climate is very constant, probably is not so efficient. I can tell only because I have some experience, not myself, but I have been close to some construction of those systems. Madrid climate and with the Madrid soil, it works very well. Efficiency is amazing. But the drawback is that, right? The energy, the heat you take in winter, you have to return in summer, so you will recover again. It's not like this kind of center of the earth, which is always hot, and you have a large supply of energy. It's very different. And you have like the most simple, right, in private houses, in which you can go just only 2 or 3 meters, and you have this kind of coil near the surface, which makes it very affordable and very easy to make. In that case, it's much more extreme. So you need to make this balance between winter and summer. And this is the point, right? So I don't know which science city was this, but it is kind of a heat storage, really not like absorbing energy from the soil. New technologies, I will go fast because again, I had some kind of developments from 10 years ago, but actually now it's mostly the same. And very few of them hit the market, right? It's like a much research going on and publications, but interestingly, little by little things improve, right? But the process is quite longer. So we have a lot of bacteria, biological production of energy. We have self-assembling solar cells, so the production becomes cheaper. I never saw those in the market, but I have seen some experiments with bacteria, algae, and greens helping not only produce green, but also energy in their own chemical processes, right? There is okay, going to almost quantum physics, working with the way the cells capture and relate to the waves also makes things more efficient. The experiments going on now of not using direct solar sunshine, but just storing it with some kind of reflection and only using the waves, right? Length waves which produce energy, and that makes more efficient. So they can go, they plan to go to around 40% efficiency in solar cells, which is amazing. Now we're happy to be 20% or so on, right? There's many things going on. And well, this is the liquid energy, right? Microbes. The research is there, and going more to science fiction, solar wind is such a huge amount of energy that could feed the full Earth. But one is how we harvest that energy, right? But now that we are in an aerospace era, well, there's also research going on, but I think it's kind of still science fiction, although the feasibility is there. The point with all those things is that there is a huge debate about energy, right? No matter how much debate we have, what everybody agrees, which is a fact, is that we need to use less energy. And this has to do with design, of course, insulation, thermal mass, ventilation, natural light, sunshine, All passive systems we already discussed, right? And also, so this design, but also lifestyle, right? No matter how well we design our buildings, if we use them carelessly, we may spend more energy than intended. There is a case, for example, the country which increased enormously, maybe first in the world, the consumption of blankets for sleeping, right? Like blankets. Well, actually, it was in Malaysia a few years ago. Malaysia's all tropical countries, they have the hot and the very hot season, right? When it is raining. So they always rely on shade and air currents and all those things. So the people are used to that heat, right? This is like a Korean summer actually. So you kind of slow down your pace, you have more nightlife and so on. But the moment they started getting air conditioned, very cheap, the comfort temperature went from 28 degrees to 20 or 18. So actually, they like to be cold. It's kind of exotic thing. So they put the air conditioning so cold, they need to have like coats and jerseys at home, and they sleep with blankets. It's so nice. It's like being in the North Pole. So the lifestyle change is not always for good. It's like and that happens also here, right? If people do not put very cold air conditioned, it seems you don't have an air conditioning so cold here. I need to put really winter clothes in my office in the afternoon here because the air condition is for the shaded area in the west, and in the east, I really freeze in my room, right? So lifestyle has a lot to do. But the problem is especially cogeneration. Those renewable sources we said, photovoltaic, windmills, hydrogen fuel, geothermal, not always the cost is paid back by the savings. And sometimes, as we say, that implementation is only cosmetic. It's just to look good. And it happens mostly with the public buildings, right? And with the corporations. This is something we will talk more on the following lectures because we are going into design and economics of the design a little bit. And there are things which are still not solved. Photovoltaic panels have a limited life. It used to be 20 years. Now they guarantee up to 40 years, right? But yet, they're extremely hard to recycle. And many of the solar panels are already in the end of the useful life. And we don't have really a perfect system to reuse or recycle them. What the industry has done is to create the obligation on the makers to take care of the panels once they end their life. That has a cost, which is applied to the moment you buy them. So European legislation, as we did, I think United States recently also implemented it. So we know they will take care. And I hope they do better than the plastics, as we saw yesterday, right? I don't know how much they can do about it. But I don't think China still implemented it, right? So if you buy Chinese panels and you end their life, either you pay for the recycling or disposal or whatever they do with it, or just throw them away and they pollute. So it's a problem which is not solved yet perfectly. So reducing energy needs, I will not comment much because this is what we have been talking the whole course, right? But this is kind of standard strategy. So it's kind of checklist, right? One thing which is, it's kind of a collecting things we already said in class. We don't need to read them. Interesting thing is we speak of oversizing, right? Electrical wires and also ducts for air, right? And so on. If you oversize them, actually, the loss is much smaller. So as we said, energy loss in electricity is a huge thing. If you can support the cost and the more use of material, you may save energy by making thicker wires, not just the minimum. And it's less dangerous because they become less hot, so you have less fire hazards. Many of the fires we have, especially residential, come from very hot wires, right? Because they are overloaded. We put more appliances than they can hold. But also with the ducts, ventilation, if the ducts are bigger, it's okay, we spend more material, you spend more space, but you need way less energy in the pumps, right? And then in the end, the savings can be larger. Because you have many devices to save energy, you can apply, and there's very cheap devices which really help you control the energy use, right? You have in the market. This is what they show the vacuum elevators, which are, we said in the conveyance, they are really energy efficient, and in the small buildings you can use them because natural light. How much can we insist on that, right? So again, see how each orientation has a different uses of light and energy, and depends very much on the climate they use and the building. I wish you stop that kind of fixation for south is good, north is bad. Everyone is good, okay? Well, whoever created the world was very wise, and he made everything with some qualities, and we have the duty to find the good thing of each of them, right? And of course, this is the design that the old-fashioned, long and narrow plans, which you have natural light everywhere in the building, not this kind of deep construction in which even in apartments, I couldn't believe they rent apartments and the office style without windows because you have already ventilation and artificial light, right? Kind of crazy. And other things, okay, we already commented in class, this kind of putting things together. And we have many examples. This is not very recent, but again, Renzo Piano, right? He is one of the guys who has studied very much in depth with experiments. He spoke about RISC the other day, right? There's the hell of a lighting engineer there, simulations, same here with Renzo Piano. You can have museums with natural light, almost perfect, right? And this intention, and they save so much energy, but not only in terms of energy. This is a famous research, which is kind of gold standard, done 23 years ago. This is in California, and the government commissioned that research actually to the makers of dope lights. So it might look like biased research, but it's published, it is online, you can access it. And they did quite interesting things. In different schools, right? They make an experiment of lighting them only with artificial light, perfectly mimicking natural light, or with top lights. Students do not know because you have just the light coming in, but consistently the results were much better in the schools which had daylight, right? Significantly better. In general, about 20% on average better, right? Independently of the socioeconomic states or geographic state, just the only difference was the light. They did some experiment with commercial retail shops. And again, we have this idea that shopping centers need artificial light because with the windows you get distracted and you have to buy. Well, of course, the question is not the view, it's the quality of the light. And consistently in any kind of store, when they applied the top lights, people stayed longer and bought more when they had natural light. Again, I heard about this from consultants here in Korea, right? They did this study, so I went into it, it's very well done. It's a huge amount of data, but still you can say, okay, this is the makers, right? It can be biased, they want to sell their top lights. So I used students as an experiment. I just happened to teach building systems already 10 times, but the first 6 times we were 3 years in this kind of classroom with windows, nice, lovely, and 3 years in some fancy building underground. And I was observing that underground classroom had worse results. So I hired a mathematician and we made the data, the calculations, and we published the article 2 years ago. Scientific articles are a pain, but this is not worrying, you can read it. It's not so long, just a reference. And this is the plot of the results of the exam, right? Midterm exam. And The years in basements and the years with windows, independent of the class being 60 or being only 30, always the results are statistically much better when you have daylight in the classroom. We checked for all possible variations, could be based on the number of students, could be based on the number of the boys and girls, could be based. The only difference which made a significant difference was the daylight or not. There's like a probably, I don't remember, I know it's kind of maybe 15% difference in grades in general. And even by the photos, left is underground artificial light. Uncorrected, you can see the light quality is different. And the question is not the views, because in some of the class we have just clerestory light, right? So there's no view at all, but the environment we have is totally different. And just, we also checked for, traditionally people consider boys are better at technical courses than girls. There's no connection. We cannot demonstrate girls or boys did better than each other. Some years, girls were better than boys. Some years were the same. Some years the boys were a bit better. So, well, it's one of the things we checked, right? So there's not difference, at least in this course, regarding sex. So boys do not get overconfident. You have to work hard, and girls do not feel this is only for boys. Often you do much better than boys, but not always. So there's not any connection about sex and not. So that kind of boys being better at technology than girls is total myth, at least in this experiment. Okay, of course, ventilation, as we commented, this is a diagram I did for a small house. I commented often, right? So to plan for the windows in a way you can use the dominant winds in summer, for example, right? Southeast in the area that house was. And again, we don't need to repeat. There's so many things we can do only by designing better, right? One thing which is become kind of standard is the CO2 sensors, right? It's very cheap device. This become very much, again, trendy with the COVID, because when we have is ventilation, we open the windows, it's great. But when you rely on mechanical ventilation, the sensors will tell you when you need to move the air, right? And that will give you at least a minimum of air, not more ventilation. That will save time of pumps working, energy, but also will have much healthier environment in the end. Radiant heating and cooling, which is interesting. Those who come to the Dream Center will have the possibility to check. I hope it is really hot, because they have radiant cooling in the lower floor, which is something we still don't see in Korea. And they have air conditioned in the top floor. And you will see the difference of environment. So Korea, I will not tell you about radiant floor for heating, because after staying in Korea, I put radiant heating in all houses again in Spain. My house is like that. But radiant cooling is also perfect. And you can do it in Korea. The problem is in Korea, summer is very humid. So you have to have a device to reduce the humidity of the air. You need to desiccate the air to have the correct humidity. Otherwise, you will have the floor wet with condensation. Madrid, for example, summer is very hot but very dry. So we don't have that problem. You can put, and doesn't need to be very cool. Just having maybe 24, 25 degrees is enough to feel the coolness, right? So temperature in the air might be not so cold, but there's not air moving. You have the humidity you need, and it's quite very pleasant. So I would encourage you to use it. But again, in climates like Korea, you need to work together with the air humidity. So you need, that makes things a bit more expensive, but it's way better than air conditioned, right? Air conditioned, you're always like too cool or too hot. You have that movement, you have the noise of the ventilators. It dries the air a lot. So it's very hard to have a comfortable air conditioned, even if it is very expensive, right? And of course, there is always an inspiration on traditional architecture, which I wish we use more, right? Actually, the interiors of Hanok and the palace are not so luminous, right? The light which comes inside is reflected, is very soft. So not only to have that direct sunshine, it's just to have the view, but also the air moving, right? And that kind of windows for air moving is something which is apparently lost in our conception of architecture. The building envelope, I don't need to talk. We will have probably a summary about it, and we are already 5 minutes to the hour, but we're on time today. Again, this is kind of putting together things we saw already in the same place, right? One thing which is interesting is the roof color. We say that in Korea, why the roofs are green, right? In Korea, in Spain, they are red. Why? Well, the problem is both red and green absorb a lot of radiation that makes it hotter. So there's a trend, even legislation limits the color of the roofs. So you absorb less energy and you alleviate the heat island effect, right? So white roof is a pain because it was dirty, but it would be ideal because you don't absorb heat. But you have even calculators to see how much heat you will reflect, so you are complying with the legislation. So the green roof in Korea, I heard it is because from the airplane you will see a lot of green and it's very green, right? It feels very natural. I think it was promoted by all the Park Tetonion telling, okay, we need to have cities looking nice even from the sky. Spain red, because you remember we commented in the Catalan roof. Usually we use a flat roof with the ceramic tiles, and that's kind of reddish. So it's kind of imitating that kind of tiled roof, right? It's kind of tradition. There's nothing else, it's not the advantage. It's just the custom of things with those colors. Okay, so you have roof calculators to see if your roof is reflecting enough light. And finally, the appliances, every machine you use. Of course, you can buy more efficient machines, which are more expensive, but you save in the end. But also, avoid things redundant. Sometimes we have too much light on, for example. In Korean houses, for some reason, in my house, we have 3 people living here in Korea. We have 3 huge refrigerators, and they're full. It used to be like a normal refrigerator for a whole family, right? But now it's kind of a very strange way of managing things. Redundancy, right? Of course, the maintenance is important. Of course, laptops spend less energy than big computers, but now we have televisions in the 100-inch television, so they're more efficient, but we have larger televisions, so that's difficult thing to work, right? The important thing, as we said, is the users, right? So management software is important if people can use it. That's the problem. It should be very simple, right? And the same with the intelligent house controls, right? So the user friendliness means anybody is able to use it. The intelligent house commands and software has been always very tricky, very hard to use, and people just abandoned it. But that's something which is still not well achieved. Well, that's interesting, as we said. Okay, let's go back. As we commented with Malaysia before, right? In winter, you put hot clothes. In summer, you put cool clothes. Not the opposite. We have people almost in swim dress in winter because the heating is so hot, and with winter clothes in summer because the air conditioning is so cold. So there's kind of contradiction, but that's very common, and not only in Korea, right? The moment you have good heating, you say, look, my heat is so good that it looks like summer. And dressing correctly helps to save a lot of energy. Okay, so now we come back to the summary we did in materials. So the only secret is to make the best use we can with the means nature provides us, the geography, passive systems, and then that will minimize the needs. So you will need less and smaller machines, and that could be more efficient. And in the end, the remaining, right, could be renewable energies, like the photovoltaic, air, geothermal, or so on. Because then the need is very small, and you might be able to afford for it. So last question, it's a long one, but still we have 2 minutes. It's again 2 questions, right? First, to improve things, to improve energy efficiency costs money, right? It has a cost. So that cost should be paid back by the savings in energy. So if you invest 100 in better insulation, you get 100 in savings of energy to do that. Or if you don't get enough savings, you reduce it. Or even if they cost more, we should spend that money, because saving energy is more important than saving money. That's the first question, right? Or maybe you do it even if you lose money, but that money should be subsidized by the governments, right? So you don't lose particular or other opinion. And if you can, in the minute we have left, say why you think that way. If there's any reason for that. This is about opinions. So we have a couple of minutes. Actually, we have a -1 minute to do it. But if you are patient enough and you want to spend 1 more minute, give me your opinion. I will be happy to read it and comment on that. Which I will show next week with other comments. And I have a lot of homework for next week, actually. You look so serious. Well, I said to you, this is not a sexy lecture, so it's very hard to make it fun. I tried at least to look nice, but I'm not sure it was possible. Okay, so that's the question. And only thing I will not insist on that is that, as we commented in the structures, design is a simulation, is a prevision. The reality happens later. So we have very painful example, Foster. London City Hall was published and praised like the most advanced building in terms of energy savings. They had all the simulations, all the experts, all the devices. So everything we said is applied here. But when they did the survey of the building in real use, it was E. It was much worse than the average building or building. And that's telling us that no matter how much we said about those simulations, those refinements, those commissionings, those design tricks, the use in the end is stubborn. So we have to be very aware that we are making a bet in the future. And as far as I know, nobody is able to preview it enough, right? So again, the way it is used, the checking after the building is finished, and the realistic consideration of how things will happen when you are built, right? Buildings are not, in the computers, everything is ideal. In the simulation, everything is perfect. In reality, nothing is perfect, and things do not work as expected. So that ends the lecture. And well, this is just a list of the books. I will plan to put them together, but they're here. So most of the data are from those books and those publications, right? And that's enough for today. Thank you for staying 5 extra minutes on Friday. If you have any kind of a question or comment, please do it. And I will see you next week. Thursday, we will go to the Energy House. So we'll have no class that day, right? Friday, we will go have class as usual. Okay, thank you.